The gown had been turned twice, let out once, and mended so many times along the hem that Eleanor had stopped counting the stitches somewhere around the third winter. She wore it anyway, because it was the only gown she owned that could be called, with any generosity, suitable for a ducal ball. The invitation had arrived a week earlier, addressed in a clerk's careful hand, and her aunt had read it aloud at breakfast with the particular smile she wore when delivering an insult disguised as news. Of course they must include her. It would look strange not to. A poor relation left off the list entirely might make people ask questions, and questions were the one thing her aunt could not abide. So Eleanor was invited. Invited the way a draft is invited into a house, through a cracked window. Invited the way weather is invited. Nobody wanted her there. Everybody simply couldn't be seen keeping her out. She stood now at the edge of the ballroom, gloved hands folded in front of her, watching candlelight break itself into 1,000 small fires across the chandeliers, and told herself that watching was a skill, not a punishment. She had gotten good at watching. Years of suppers eaten last, of conversations conducted just outside her hearing, of being present and invisible in the same breath, had taught her how a room worked before the room ever noticed she was in it. This room worked the way she expected. Silk and jewels and laughter pitched exactly loud enough to be admired, and beneath it, moving like a current under still water, the whispers. She heard her name before she heard anything else. Not spoken kindly, "There's the cousin," someone murmured behind a fan the color of crushed raspberries. "The poor one? Did you see the gown? I believe I saw that same shade of gray on my grandmother's drapes." A ripple of laughter, careful and polite, the kind that could be denied later if anyone asked. Eleanor did not turn. She had learned that lesson early too, that turning toward cruelty only fed it, gave it a face to aim at. She kept her eyes on the dance floor where couples moved to the pattern of a quadrille, skirts flashing gold and rose and deep forest green, and she thought, not for the first time, how strange it was that poverty had a smell. Not dirt, not decay, just old fabric, and lavender water applied too many times to cover it, and beneath that, faintly, the particular staleness of a life, lived carefully, so that nothing would wear out any faster than it had to. She smelled like carefulness, she was fairly sure of it. Across the ballroom, beneath a portrait of some long-dead ancestor in an unflattering wig, the Duke of Ashworth stood, surrounded by people who wanted things from him. He wore black, unrelieved, except for the white of his cravat, and he wore it the way some men wore armor, correctly, completely, and without any apparent pleasure in it. He was, by every account, whispered in every drawing-room in the city, cold, unmoved. A man who had buried a father and a brother within 18 months of each other and had simply gone on jaw-set, ledgers balanced as though grief were another estate matter to be managed and closed. He was not listening to the man beside him, who was explaining at some length the superior breeding of his hunting dogs. He was looking across the room at a woman in a gray gown standing very still near the wall, the way a person stands when they have trained themselves not to take up space. He had noticed her the moment she arrived. It would have been difficult not to notice her, actually, given that every other woman in the room glittered like a chandelier, and she alone stood dressed like the memory of a candle. But it was not the gown that held his attention. It was her face. He excused himself from the hunting dogs, with a sentence so brief it barely qualified as one, and began to cross the ballroom. It took him longer than it should have. The room was crowded, and people wanted his attention the way plants want sunlight, turning toward him as he passed, offering compliments, offering daughters, offering anything at all that might catch and hold him for even a moment. He gave each of them the same small, correct nod, and kept walking, and did not stop. Eleanor did not see him coming until he was nearly upon her, because she had long ago trained her eyes to skim rooms, rather than fix on any one point in them, a habit born of not wanting to be caught staring at food she could not have, or company she was not welcome to join. So, when the Duke of Ashworth stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she caught the scent of him, beeswax and cold stone, something faintly of horses, something else she couldn't name, she nearly stepped back before she caught herself. "Your Grace," she said, and dropped into a curtsy so correct it might have been carved from the same careful stone as the rest of her evening. He did not return the courtesy with words right away. He simply looked at her, the way a man looks at something he has been searching a long time for, and has, at last, unexpectedly found. Then he said, "You are Miss Eleanor Ashcombe." It was not a question, though it had the shape of one. "I am your Grace," she said, and something in her chest went very tight and very careful, the way it did whenever a stranger knew her name and she did not know why. He extended his arm. Around them, she felt rather than saw the ballroom notice. The whispers, which had been a low current all evening, seemed to catch and hold, the way a held breath sounds louder than any sound at all. "I would be obliged," he said, "if you would allow me to escort you to your seat." "I have not yet been shown to one, Your Grace," she said, because it was true, and because some old stubborn honesty in her would not let her simply take his arm and pretend otherwise. "Then allow me to correct that oversight," he said. And he did not lead her toward the long tables at the edges of the hall, where the poor relations and the unmarried aunts and the younger sons, without prospects, were seated, where she had fully expected to spend the evening picking at cold fowl and listening to conversation that did not include her. He led her the entire length of the ballroom, past the raspberry fan and its owner, whose mouth fell into a small, perfect circle of disbelief, past a cluster of debutantes in white muslin who stopped their chatter mid-syllable, past his own mother, the Dowager Duchess, whose face did something complicated and quickly smoothed itself into something else. He led her all the way to the head table, to the great carved chair, set at his own right hand, the seat of highest honor in the entire room, the seat that every ambitious mother in the city had spent the season maneuvering her daughter toward. And he pulled it out himself. He did not summon a footman, he did not gesture for someone else to perform the courtesy. He, the Duke of Ashworth, third in line to speak to the king himself should the occasion ever arise, pulled out a chair with his own hands for a woman in a twice-turned gray gown, and did not so much as glance at the room to see who was watching. Eleanor sat, because there was nothing else to do, because her legs had gone strange and unreliable beneath her, because refusing would have caused a scene far larger than accepting. Around them, the ballroom had gone silent. It was a particular kind of silence, not the silence of a room where nothing is happening, but the silence of a room where everyone is doing furious, frantic mental arithmetic, trying to understand a sum that refuses to add up. A poor relation, a faded gown, the highest seat in the house. The whispers had said everything they had to say about her already, about the gown, about the family that had let her come looking like that, about what it meant that she had no dowry worth mentioning and no prospects worth discussing. The silence said something else entirely. It said that whatever the whispers believed about her worth, the most powerful man in the room did not agree. The Duke took his own seat beside her, unfolded his napkin with the unhurried calm of a man who had not just upended the entire social order of an evening's entertainment, and said, in a voice pitched only for her, "I hope the seat is to your satisfaction." Eleanor looked at him, really looked, for the first time, past the black coat and the cold reputation and the crossed length of the ballroom, and found that his eyes were not cold at all. They were watchful, careful, the eyes of a man who had learned, the same as she had, that a room could turn on you if you weren't paying attention. "It is an excellent seat, Your Grace," she said, "though I confess I do not understand how I came to deserve it." He considered this for a moment, the way he seemed to consider everything, as though words were currency, and he did not intend to spend them carelessly. "Deserving," he said finally, "has very little to do with where people are seated in this city. If it did, half this room would be eating in the stable yard." And despite herself, despite the whispers, despite the gown, despite years of careful, quiet caution, Eleanor laughed. It was not a loud laugh. It was not even a long one. But it was real, and it carried just slightly across the too quiet table, and several heads turned toward the sound of it as though they could not quite believe what they were hearing. The Dowager Duchess, 3 seats down, set her wineglass down with a click that was not quite loud enough to be called a slam, but came close. "Ashworth," she said, in the particular tone mothers use when they mean to correct their sons in front of company and pretend it is merely conversation, "I don't believe you've introduced your guest to the rest of the table." Eleanor felt the old, familiar tightening return to her chest. Here it was, the correction, the reminder of her place, delivered smoothly enough that no one could later say it had been unkind, and cutting all the same for how smoothly it had been delivered. But the Duke did not flinch. "Miss Ashcombe," he said, "is the daughter of the late Charles Ashcombe. Her father was a friend of my own. Before he passed, I've been attempting to make her acquaintance for some time." This, too, landed strangely on the table. Eleanor herself did not know what to make of it, because she could not recall her father ever mentioning a duke among his friends, and her father had died when she was 7, and she had spent every year since trying to hold on to the little she remembered of him before her aunt's version of the story. Poor Charles, so improvident, so careless with what little he left behind, replaced it entirely. She turned to look at the Duke, and found him already watching her, as if waiting to see what she would do with the sentence he had just handed her. "I did not know my father had friends of such consequence," she said carefully. "Your father," said the Duke, "had a great many things that consequence never noticed." He paused. That was, I think, rather the trouble. It was an odd thing to say, cryptic in a way that made her chest tighten again, though not from humiliation this time, from something closer to hope, or to fear, or to the particular ache that lives in the space between the two. Before she could ask what he meant, the first course arrived, borne in on silver trays by footmen in identical livery, and the scent of roast pheasant and something rich with wine and thyme rolled across the table, and Eleanor's stomach, traitorous and honest, clenched with a hunger she had spent years learning to make quiet. She had not eaten properly in 2 days. Her aunt's household did not extend its hospitality generously in the days before an event where appearances mattered, on the theory that a thin niece photographed better in a worn gown than a well-fed one did. She reached for her fork with hands she hoped did not shake, and found, to her surprise, that the footman, serving their end of the table, gave her the largest portion at it, larger even than the one he gave the Duke. She glanced up. The Duke was watching this too, with the faint, unreadable expression of a man filing away information for later use. "You'll want to eat that before it's cold," he said mildly. "I am reliably informed the kitchen takes it personally when food goes back untouched." Everyone else at the table seemed to take this as permission to resume their own conversations, low and hurried, clearly eager to discuss amongst themselves what on earth had just happened, and Eleanor understood that the Duke had just done her the kindness of returning the room's attention to itself so that she might eat without an audience. She had not expected kindness tonight. She had expected to survive the evening the way she survived most evenings, quietly, carefully, without incident. Kindness was a foreign country, and she did not entirely trust the welcome. "Why?" she asked quietly, not looking at him, keeping her eyes on her plate. "Why any of this?" The Duke did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice had lost its dry, careful edge and had something else in it instead, something that sounded strangely like guilt. "Because," he said, "I made your father a promise once, and I have been rather a long time keeping it." Eleanor set down her fork. "What promise?" she said, but he only shook his head once and said, "Not tonight. Tonight, I only wish to see you seated where you belonged." "And where is that, your grace?" she asked, and heard in her own voice something sharper than she'd intended, something that had crept in over years of being told where she belonged by people who had never once asked her opinion on the matter. He looked at her then, fully, and something in his gaze made the whole glittering ballroom around them seem to recede, the music and the candlelight and the low, unending murmur of gossip all fading to a kind of hush. "Beside me," he said simply. "For a start." She did not know what to say to that. She was not sure the ballroom knew what to say to that either, judging by the fresh ripple of whispers that broke out 3 tables down, quickly hushed, quickly redirected into safer conversation about the quality of the wine. Eleanor picked her fork back up, mostly to have something to do with her hands, and ate her pheasant, which was excellent, rich with thyme and something faintly of orange peel, and she thought absurdly that she would remember the taste of it for the rest of her life, not because of the food itself, but because of the strange, dizzying fact of eating it here in this chair, beside this man, while half the room tried and failed to look as though they weren't staring. Across the table, her aunt's youngest daughter, a cousin named Margaret, who had inherited their grandmother's sharp chin and their aunt's sharper eye for social advantage, was watching with an expression Eleanor couldn't quite name. Not quite jealousy, something more complicated than that. Margaret had been groomed, polished, and paraded before every eligible man in the city for 2 seasons running. All in the hopes of exactly this outcome: a duke's attention, a duke's favor, a duke's hand extended across a crowded ballroom. And here it had landed, inexplicably, possibly, on the cousin in the gray gown that used to be her grandmother's drapes. Eleanor caught Margaret's eye for a moment, and Margaret looked away first, which was its own kind of answer. The Dowager Duchess, for her part, had recovered her composure with the speed of a woman who had spent 40 years perfecting the art of never appearing surprised in public, whatever chaos raged beneath the surface. She leaned toward her son and said, in a voice pitched for the whole table to hear, though dressed up as private conversation, "You must tell us more about your friendship with the late Mr. Ashworth. I confess I don't recall you ever mentioning him." "There is a great deal I don't mention, Mother," the Duke said. And there was something final in the way he said it, a door closing gently but firmly, that made even the Dowager Duchess set down her fork and look, for just a moment, uncertain. The rest of the dinner passed in a haze that Eleanor would only half remember afterward. She remembered the wine which she drank sparingly, out of long habit and the fear of what a loosened tongue might say in present company. She remembered the low, steady warmth of the Duke's attention, which did not waver toward the more glittering guests the way she had expected it to, the way every other man's attention always eventually did. She remembered the second course, the third, and the way her body, so long accustomed to hunger being the quieter, more manageable companion, seemed almost bewildered by abundance. And she remembered most of all the moment when the musicians in the gallery struck up the first notes of a waltz, and the Duke rose from his chair and extended his hand to her, in front of the entire ballroom, in front of every whispering fan and sharp-chinned cousin and recovering Dowager Duchess in the room, and said, "Miss Ashcombe, would you do me the honor?" It was not, she noted distantly, phrased as a question. Dukes, she was learning, rarely phrased anything as a question when they had already decided the answer. She should refuse. Every instinct that years of careful survival had built into her said that this was too much, too visible, too dangerous a thing to accept. That attention like this, once drawn, could not be easily returned to its box, and that she would pay for it later in ways she could not yet calculate from an aunt who did not forgive being upstaged. But some other instinct, newer and smaller and only just discovering its own voice, said something different. Said that she had spent her whole life shrinking to fit the space allotted her, and that perhaps, just this once, in this ballroom, in this gray gown that had been mocked before she'd even crossed the threshold, she did not have to shrink at all. She placed her hand in his fingers closed around hers, warm and certain, and she felt that warmth travel up through her wrist and settle somewhere behind her ribs, in the place where hope lived, when hope dared to live in her at all. They moved onto the floor together, and the other couples, who had been waiting with the particular hunger of people who love nothing more than watching a scandal in real time, parted to let them through, and then closed in around them to dance their own steps, though Eleanor suspected very few of them were paying much attention to their own feet. The Duke danced, the way he did everything else, economically, precisely, without wasted motion, and yet there was something in the way he held her. A careful, deliberate gentleness, as though he understood without being told that she was not accustomed to being handled with care. "You dance well," he observed, "for someone who I suspect has not had many opportunities to. I am reliably informed I do not, actually, dance particularly well," she said. "Though I have not been told so this directly before, I did not say you danced badly," he said. "I said you danced well for someone with few opportunities. There is a difference." "Is there?" she said. "There is," he said. "One is an insult. The other is an observation. I am told I do not make jokes, so you may take that as the observation it was intended to be. Everyone else in this room seems to have opinions about me tonight," she said, letting a little more edge into her voice than perhaps was wise. "But they don't usually ask permission first." Something in his face shifted, the barest suggestion of amusement, quickly and expertly suppressed, the way a man suppresses a laugh he has decided, is not appropriate to the occasion, but cannot quite convince himself to abandon entirely. No, he agreed, they don't. It's one of the more tiresome features of a room like this one. Everyone has opinions, and remarkably few of them have facts. And what facts do you have, Your Grace? She asked, that the rest of the room does not. He was quiet for a moment, turning her through the steps of the waltz with the same careful precision, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped low enough that only she could hear it over the music. I know that your father did not simply leave you badly provided for through carelessness, he said. I know that there is more to that story than has ever been told to you. And I know that I owe you an explanation I have been putting off far longer than I should have, out of cowardice I am not proud of. The music swelled around them, bright and indifferent to the sudden cold drop in Eleanor's stomach. What do you mean? She said. What explanation? Not here, he said. Not tonight, but soon. I promise you that much, and I do not make promises lightly. She wanted to press him further. Every practical, careful part of her, the part that had learned to ask exactly the right questions at exactly the right moments, because opportunities to ask questions at all came so rarely, wanted to stop dancing entirely, and demand, he explained himself immediately, in full, without the gauze of ballroom courtesy wrapped around it. But the music was still playing, and his hand was still warm around hers, and something in his eyes when she searched them held not evasion, but a kind of weary, honest grief, the look of a man carrying a weight he had chosen, for reasons of his own, to carry alone for far too long. Soon, she said, instead testing the word in her mouth like it might dissolve before she finished it. Soon, he agreed. They finished the dance in silence after that, though it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was, Eleanor thought, the particular silence of two people who have said something true to each other and are both still absorbing the shape of it. When the music ended, he did not immediately release her hand. Sss. He held it a moment longer than the dance required, and the ballroom, which had been watching the whole exchange with the barely restrained hunger of an audience that senses a story unfolding faster than it can be reported, seemed to hold its breath along with them. Then he escorted her back to her seat, the seat of highest honor, still hers, still empty and waiting, because no one had dared claim it in her absence, and pulled out her chair once more, and this small, repeated courtesy, so simple, so easily overlooked, struck Eleanor as somehow more significant than the crossing of the entire ballroom had been. He had done it twice now, not once, as a show for the room, but twice, when no one was quite paying the same close attention anymore, when the gesture cost him nothing in spectacle and gained him nothing in reputation. He had done it, she understood slowly, simply because he meant it. The rest of the evening passed differently than it had begun. Two ward of the Duke's attention had spread through the ballroom with the speed such things always traveled, and Eleanor found herself for the first time in longer than she could remember the recipient of careful, curious courtesy from people who would not have crossed the room to acknowledge her an hour before. Squo, a matron who had sniffed audibly at Eleanor's gown during the receiving line, now complimented its color, calling it a subtle, sophisticated gray, quite unlike the garish silks so many young women wore these days. Margaret, her cousin, approached with a stiff, careful smile and asked whether Eleanor might care to be introduced to a gentleman of her acquaintance. A courtesy Margaret had never once extended in 4 years of shared roofs and shared tables. Eleanor accepted these overtures with the same careful, watchful courtesy she extended to everything, because she had not survived this long by trusting sudden kindness at face value. But she noted, with a small private, unfamiliar satisfaction, that the whispers which had followed her into the ballroom had changed their shape entirely by the time the evening wound toward its close. They were still whispers. They still traveled behind fans and over shoulders and through the gaps between polite sentences. But they were not laughing at her anymore. Near the end of the evening, as guests began drifting toward the doors and carriages began queuing in the drive beyond, the Duke found her again, standing near the same wall where he had first crossed the ballroom to reach her, though this time she stood there by choice rather than by exile. "I trust the evening was not entirely unbearable," he said. "It was not what I expected," she said, which was true in every direction that sentence could be taken. Good or bad, he asked. She considered this honestly, the way she considered most things, both. She said, "Though I find myself hoping it tips further toward good before the night is finished." He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression softened in a way she had not yet seen from him. Not the careful courtesy of a host, not the dry, guarded wit he'd offered across the dinner table, but something plainer and more unguarded than either. "I would like to call on you," he said, "properly, with your aunt's permission, though I suspect that permission will require some persuading." "You suspect correctly," Eleanor said, and something rueful crept into her voice despite herself. "Then I shall bring my most persuasive arguments," he said. "I am told I have several, though I rarely use them, on the theory that most problems in life do not require quite so much artillery." "And what artillery will you use for this one?" she asked. He was quiet a moment. Then he said simply, "The truth, I think, it has a way of settling arguments that flattery cannot." She did not know. Standing there in her twice-turned gray gown, with the ballroom emptying slowly around them, and the candles burning low in their sconces, filling the air with the scent of beeswax and melted tallow, quite what truth he meant, or how large a truth it might turn out to be. But she knew, with a certainty that surprised her in its steadiness, that she wanted to hear it, wanted to hear all of it, whatever shape it took, whatever it changed about the careful, narrow life she had built for herself out of watchfulness and quiet endurance. She had come to this ball expecting to be exactly what the whispers said she was: a poor relation, an afterthought, a gray shape at the edge of a glittering room, invited only because excluding her would have raised more questions than including her did. She left it instead as something else entirely, not yet named, not yet certain, but no longer quite so easy to dismiss. The Duke of Ashworth walked her to her aunt's carriage himself, past the last lingering clusters of departing guests, past the fans and the whispers, which had not stopped, would probably never entirely stop, but which had changed their tune so thoroughly that Eleanor almost didn't recognize them as the same sound that had greeted her on arrival. He handed her up into the carriage with the same careful, deliberate courtesy he had shown all evening, and as the door closed and the horses began to pull away, Eleanor looked back through the small window and saw him still standing there, in the torchlight of the drive, watching the carriage go, as though he meant to hold the image of it in his mind for safekeeping. She did not know yet what promise he had made to her father, or what truth he intended to bring to her aunt's parlor, with his most persuasive arguments. She did not know that the answer to both would unravel everything she believed about her own name, her own history, and the fortune she had been told her entire life did not exist. She only knew as the carriage rattled through the dark streets toward home that, for the first time in longer than she could remember, she had been seen, not glanced at, not measured and dismissed. Seen, fully, by a man who had crossed an entire ballroom to prove it, and who had not once, in all the hours that followed, looked at her as though she were something less than she was. The silence that had followed his gesture across that glittering room had said everything the whispers before it had failed to. It had said that worth was not stitched into the seams of a gown, nor measured in the size of a dowry, nor decided by the careful, cruel calculations of people who had never once bothered to look past the surface of things. It had said, simply and completely, that she mattered. And for a woman who had spent her whole life being told, in ways large and small, that she did not. That silence was the loudest thing she had ever heard. Thank you so much for staying with this story all the way to the end. If you felt something during Eleanor's walk across that ballroom, I would love to know what. Tell me down in the comments which city you're watching from tonight, and tell me what this story made you feel. And if you have a favorite line, share it below. I read every single one. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories just like it. Until then, from all of us here, good night and sweet dreams.